Great. Today we're going to start our journey in the book of Exodus. We'll find out that Exodus picks up where Genesis had left off. Now, in order to properly understand Exodus, one needs to read and first understand Genesis. So starting off with the book of Genesis for us, as we did, provides the ability for us to, I think, rightfully understand Exodus a lot better. Genesis explains how and why God's people, Israel, left and went into Egypt, why they're in Egypt and why they're going to leave Egypt. God providentially led them here to grow them into a larger nation, a large nation, one of the multitudes of people. Now remember, when they were back in the land of Canaan as a small family, there were social pressures pulling them back into the land of Canaan and the ways of the world that existed within there. It seems that God brought them into Egypt to be nourished and grown and to be separate from the rest of the nations. Even though they were in the land of Egypt, their lifestyle kept them separate for the most part. So God used the distinction to grow them with limited outside influence. That's why God brought them into Egypt, it seems like. So God used their distinction to help keep them separate. Now, of course, we see how God used the events around Joseph and the brethren and also the famine to bring the entire family into Egypt, into a portion of Egypt known as Goshen. The perfect place Goshen was to raise animals and to be separate from much of the Egyptians. And it is here that Genesis 50 left off. The entire family of Jacob, the entire family of Israel, was now in Egypt. So this is where we pick it up here in chapter 1 of Exodus. So look at verse 1. It says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already." Let's go ahead and let's ask the Lord to bless our time here as we move into Exodus. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity we have here again today to consider your words. Father, today we'll start a new book, opening up the words of the book of Exodus. Father, I pray that as we go through this book, that you give us understanding, that you give us clarity, that, Father, we learn new things and be challenged, especially as we see here this lays the groundwork for us to understand salvation and redemption, your plan for your people, and how you led your people out of bondage and into the ability to live for you. Father, I pray that you bless our efforts as we go through this book, especially here today. I pray all this in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, so we just read the first 6 verses of the chapter here, and you said that we have a number of names. Before we get into these names and even consider these things, I think it's important to understand what is being said here in the very first verse. It's important to know that the first verse is where we find the name for this book. Now, you might go and take a look at that and say, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense, because what we have here is we have just an introductory statement which says, now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. And we know the second book of the Bible, of the Torah, known as Exodus. And so we know it as Exodus, but Exodus is a Greek word that means going out or departure. So that makes sense. When we think of the word Exodus, we think of people leaving, of Israel leaving Egypt. But that's not really the title of the book. That's been more a title that's been acquired over time. Because it comes, as I said, the word Exodus is a Greek word. And the Greek word the Exodus is the title of the book that was applied in the Septuagint, or the LXX. And so this is something that's carried over into our English versions of things. However, a Jew or a Hebrew would know this book as Shemoth, which is the word names. Shemoth, or names. It is actually the second word in the Hebrew and is translated as names in the English. And so you can see here on the screen, here is the Hebrew verse 1. And you can see that the second word, so remember it reads here from right to left. And so the second word is the Hebrew word Shemoth. And so if you hear other people refer to the book of Shemot or Shemoth, some people would say Shemos, it has the idea of names. So in our English, it is the fifth word. It says, now these are the names of the children of Israel. But that comes from the word Shemoth. And so I'll continue to refer to it as Exodus because that's what we're typically referred to. But if you were into a Hebrew or Messianic or somebody else that knows Hebrew very well or is versed in that, they're going to refer to it as Shemoth. So in case you hear that, at least you kind of have that connection, understand why that is the case. Now, we can see here, as we go through in verses 2, 3, and 4, we have the 12, we actually have 11. We have 11 names of Jacob's sons. And then the 12th name of Joseph is found in verse 5. So we see here the 12 sons of Jacob listed. Now we saw a similar list back in Genesis 46. If you want to turn back to Genesis 46. At the end of Genesis, we have a list of names as well. Now there's a lot more names in here, but if you take a look to start with, Genesis 46, this is where God tells Jacob it's okay to go down into the land. And if you take a look at verse 3, this is what God declares. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. So you remember we read this back here. This is when Joseph had revealed himself to his brethren. His brethren had gone back and to tell their father. At first, Jacob was a little surprised with all that, to find out that Joseph was still alive. Then God reveals himself to Jacob to say, Jacob, go down into Egypt. And so here, this is as they're beginning to travel, God reveals that to him in Beersheba. And this is where chapter 46 occurs. And then when you reread verses 8 through 25, we're not going to go through that here during this session here, but we read this earlier, we find all the 12 sons and their families listed as well in these verses. And then we get down to verse 26, and we read here in verse 26, it says, all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins beside Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 66, so 66. Verse 27, and the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls, and all the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. So that'd be 70. So this lines up with verse 5 of Exodus chapter 1. If we turn back there again, this lines up with Exodus chapter 1 and verse 5 when it says, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now, so we see here the connection of the 70, and so the connection between 46 and Exodus 1, and with all the families that are listed. Now, I'm not going to rework all the different details. So if you remember when we were in Genesis 46, we spent a whole session just dealing with trying to reconcile the numbers with the names and putting things together. And then also trying to come back to Acts chapter 7, where Stephen lists out and says there were 75 souls. And remember how some individuals use that to connect things back to the Greek version of the Old Testament and use that to correct the Hebrew of the Old Testament. I'm not going to go through all of that here again today, but just realize and a reminder that there is an answer to be able to put the Scripture together and be able to take a look at the numbers that are present here. So if you want to go through that again, that recording is up on the internet and you can cover that in more detail. But it is interesting to know that there are differences between the list if you go through Genesis 46 and Exodus chapter 1. And you have the list of the 12 names. So I put this on the slide right here. You can see in the first column is Exodus chapter 1. You have the listing of the names that are present here in verses 2 through 4 and into 5. You can see it goes the 12 sons. It goes from Reuben all the way down into Joseph. And if you were to compare the list of Genesis 46, you see that the 12 sons are listed, and the first 6 names are lined up exactly, but the last 6 names are not. Now, there's a lot of questions about, well, why does the names not line up exactly? Why are they different the way it is? I'm not sure of the answer. There's been a number of things that are proposed, and maybe that is something that will be something you can look into and pull apart. But when you compare the verses in chapter 46 of Genesis to Exodus 1, there is difference in the last 6 that are listed. Now, if you remember, when we went through Genesis 49, we have Jacob blessing the 12 sons. And that listing is different than these two listings. But however, when we were considering the prophetic nature of those names in the order, it presented how God was going to work among the children of Israel throughout the future, which to us is partly history, but there's still a future element that exists there. And so in Genesis 46, we see one list of names. In Exodus 1, we see another list of names. So there is some differences, but they're also describing the same event. The entering of God's people, Jacob and his family, into Egypt. But the context is different. The context of Genesis 46 is where we have God's deliverance of his people from the famine and putting his people into Egypt. So there's deliverance there from the famine. When we're going into Exodus chapter 1, the context is slightly different. Now we have the accounting of the names again, but we have the deliverance of God for his people, but not from the famine, but from Egypt. And so, this, like I said, this would be a study. I just haven't studied this out further. There are a bunch of different ideas about why this is the case, but the Scripture never provides that rationale. But just realize there is a difference in the order of the names. But one thing is clear from both the passages is that all of Jacob's family, all of Israel, went into Egypt. And all of Jacob's family, all of Israel, will go out from Egypt. They're all accounted for. And I think that's one of the significant themes that you run in Genesis 46 with Exodus 1, is that everyone went in and everybody goes out. All their household, all the family. And so even though there is a difference in the order of the names, I think God is trying to say something here, but he doesn't come out and just say that. But there is the point that's being made is that all the 12 sons of Jacob go in and all 12 sons go out. So you go back here to Exodus chapter 1, and we take a look at verse 6. So Exodus chapter 1 and verse 6. And it says here, "And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation." And so here we see there's another connection point between Genesis and Exodus. Because remember, Genesis 50 left off with Joseph's death. We read that at the very end of Genesis 50. And then we also see here in the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, we see a reference to Joseph's death in verse 6. So what is clear is that Joseph and his brothers eventually all died. So we see that in verse 6, it says, "And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation." So it's not saying the entire family died out. But what it's saying is that generation that went down into Egypt, they eventually all died. And all that entire generation. It's making the point that there came a time that all those that in Egypt were Egypt born. They're Egyptian born. And think about that. Is that, for example, if God were to lift us up and he was to move us across the country. And so he's done that to my family. We've gone from Minnesota, we've gone to Connecticut, we've come back to Minnesota again. And we have certain individuals in my family that were born in Minnesota, they went into Connecticut, and they came back. And for them, they're just coming back home. But we had certain individuals that were born in Connecticut, and then they came here. And so for them to come here, it's a different experience for them. And so for them, they feel like they're still part of Connecticut in a way. And so if now we eventually, time passes, and we were all to pass away, and there'd be another generation, all they would know is Minnesota. Or if we were to move to a different part of the country, the same type of thing is when the new generation arises, this is now home for them. And so you get to think that now the individuals that are in Egypt, they are now all native-born Egyptians, in a sense. They're still Hebrew in identification, but their place where they're comfortable with, their place where they abide in, is the land of Goshen. And so that kind of plays out the part here of understanding what the mindset would be, especially as more time progresses. And we'll deal with that timetable in a moment here towards the end of the message. I think it's important for us to get grounded on the part of again here. But the world now was Egypt. There is now no memory of the land of Canaan. And so this is the context we have going into in the book of Exodus. Back in Genesis, it was still the land of Canaan back in their memory here. Verse 7. "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So here, there's a very clear point being made. Israel was growing, and they were growing, and growing, and growing. You think about how many times it's said in different ways here. It says the children of Israel were fruitful, 1, and increased abundantly, 2, and multiplied, 3, and waxed exceedingly mighty, 4, and the land was filled with them, 5. 5 different ways God is trying to convey to us that he blessed Israel and grew them into a mighty nation. You see, what this is here's a testimony of the faithfulness of Yehovah. This is the fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham. So a reminder, go back to Genesis chapter 12, because Exodus 1 and verse 7 is speaking to what God had said to Abraham back here in Genesis chapter 12. Take a look at verse 2. So Genesis 12 and verse 2, it says, "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." So we've dealt with this series of verses here in Genesis 12 a number of times now, but as it says here in the first part of verse 2, it says, "And I will make of thee a great nation." He didn't make Abraham a great nation in the days of Abraham, or in the day of Isaac, even in the days of Jacob. They were not yet a great nation. 70 souls are connected with Jacob when he comes in, but that's still not a great nation. It doesn't happen until we get to Exodus chapter 1. But God had also said that, take a look at Genesis 22. So there's a number of times that this is said here, and so God kept trying to remind him that there is a great blessing that is coming. Genesis chapter 22, and one of those forms of the blessing was the multitude of the size of the nation. Genesis 22, just take a look at verse 15. Genesis 22:15, it says, "And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies." And so here we see this promise that God is going to grow his descendants and make them a great, mighty nation. And so when we get to chapter 46, we just read this. Go ahead and turn that again here. One more place here in Genesis. Take a look at Genesis 46. When we get to the stage of God moving his people into Egypt, again, there were 70 souls. But remember what he had said. We read this verse earlier. Take a look at Genesis 46 and take a look at verse 3. This is what God declares to Jacob when he is in Beersheba on his way to Egypt. Verse 3. "And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation." So the nation was not meant to stop at 70. It was supposed to grow much larger. And so he says, go down to Egypt, because it is there that I'm going to fulfill the promise that I made to Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 12. And so, it should not surprise us to see this piece, but here we get some more clarity in the timing. Now, when we go to Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, the text that we read here should not surprise us. As it says here, the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. The text we see here should not be surprising. This is Yehovah's doing. Now, what is interesting, though, one thing that is interesting in these phrases that are found here is the wording that is used to describe this fruitfulness that happened in the nation is used earlier in the creation account. And so take a look here in verse 7. We see this phrase, increased abundantly. That's one Hebrew word. So and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. This is the word sharats. And it's the same word used and found in Genesis chapter 1 in verse 20. So go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 20. It says here, "And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, and fowl that may fly in the earth in the open firmament of heaven." So here we see the reference to waters, bring forth abundantly. That's the same word. So bring forth abundantly. And then the words moving creatures. So This word here could be translated as swarm and swarmers. So the idea is that let the water bring forth the swarmers and the swarmers that have life type of idea. And so this idea of this great multitude of bringing forth. So God compares his people and what he does to them to how he fills the oceans with all these fish. That's kind of the idea here. So they kind of go and they spread out and they multiply abundantly. And so this word is used to describe God's creative act of populating the world with his creation. And so we have a similar thing going on here. God is working among his people to greatly multiply them, to greatly increase their numbers. And so it says here in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, it says they waxed exceeding mighty. So there's large number of people that continue to grow and grow and grow in this very large number. And so this phrase, wax exceeding mighty, it literally reads very numerous. So you get this idea of a large number of people. And this happens so much that it says the land was filled with them. Now what this is telling us is that there was an overwhelming number of Hebrews in Egypt. A very large number of Hebrews in Egypt. And notice even what Pharaoh says in verse 9. So skip down to verse 9 momentarily. It says, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." So when it says that the land was filled with them, and then we find that Pharaoh's acknowledgement there's more of them than there is of us, it tells us that there's more Hebrews than Egyptians. Think about that. 70 go in, 70 plus go in, and now we have so many Hebrews that there's more Hebrews than there are Egyptians. And we know that there's the number of Hebrews that leave Egypt is somewhere between 2 and possibly even as large as 6 million. And so there is a large number of people. So we'll get to that number later on. But there's a large number of Hebrews here that are in there. And so it is at this point that it becomes clear that Israel had grown beyond the region of Goshen. They would expand it out. And so that's what it says here, and they filled the land. So they would have filled up Goshen and then continued to expand out all within the land of Egypt. And now it's generally understood that there are more, that the Hebrews or the Israelites were more than just herdsmen now. And they got involved in other things. The text doesn't say, but they would have been involved in agriculture. They'd have other occupations as well. And so they would have started intermingling with the Egyptians to a certain extent. And so that we know they're in the fields, we know the other occupations. And so Egypt was becoming the land of the Hebrews. Think about that's what's going on here. Egypt was becoming the land of the Hebrews. And so we continue on in verse 8 here. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. The text now fast forwards a number of years. It goes from Joseph's death to the multiplication of the nation of Israel to now a new king that is over Egypt. The text states that this new king, the Pharaoh, did not know Joseph. The word know is the Hebrew word yadab, which is used in a variety of different ways, but it has to do with kind of intimate knowledge or good knowledge or detailed type knowledge. And so the word here in the context refers to having insight or understanding in this context. And so this is more than just connected to this succession of kings. It's not just a matter of where one king died or one pharaoh died and another pharaoh rose up. Now we know through history that there were a number of times that other nations came in and overtook Egypt. Or there were times when Egypt reclaimed the throne. They overthrew the government and set up a new one. And that seems to be what's being indicated here. It is not that the good things that Joseph did for the Egyptians was forgotten because of this passage of time. That something happened with this change of leadership that caused the deeds of Joseph to be forgotten or pushed away. To basically say, hey, we're not interested in these things. And so either it has to do with a foreign individual coming in, they didn't know anything about Joseph whatsoever, or the word know also has the idea of we're not interested in what Joseph did. And so So there's some individuals that connect the idea of when it says that God knew or remembered Israel. This is the opposite of this, where this king chose not to know what Joseph had done, or purposely forgot what Joseph had done, or purposely pushed it away. That's kind of the idea here. And so it seems to be connected with a change in leadership. It's not just about the passage of time. And so there are a number of individuals that believe this is connected to the Egyptians retaking the leadership. And so you see why that's the case here as the verses continue. Because it says in verse 9, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." And so this new king is saying to his people that the Israelites are becoming more numerous. Now, if you remember right, when Joseph entered in the land a number of years earlier, that it said that, for example, Potiphar was an Egyptian. And so it seems to be calling out that the majority of the leadership were not Egyptians. And so here when you put Exodus 1 in connection to what we had read earlier, it seems like the Egyptians regained the throne somehow. Or the individuals that came in and accepted leadership were Egyptian related. And so many individuals believe that when Joseph ascended to be the second in command, that the Pharaoh king was actually of Semitic origin. And so out of Shem's line, that wasn't of the Egyptians that had taken over. So trying to put some of the things together we learned earlier here. But again, verse 9, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." So here we can see that the new Pharaoh is strategizing with his people on what to do with the Israelites. He's saying here we have a problem. There's more of them than there is of us. And this could be a problem for us later on. They're observing how they have grown into a great number of people. And they do not realize, they don't know that this is Yehovah's doing. We know that the scripture tells us this. But they just observe what is going on. They observe that they're multiplying more and more. And we see this even in our society today, where certain people groups are multiplying more than other groups of people. Part of that is because we, as the people that are here to start with, are failing to have many children. And the people that are coming in from other countries, they're growing more because they have high birth rates. And so there's some parts of the country that are observing there's more of them than there is of us. And so that could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing. Now for the Egyptians, they're realizing at this point this could be problematic. And so they list the problem here. Because on one hand, they don't want them to be in a position to rise up and to fight against them if they have an opportunity to do so. This is not saying that the Israelites would do that. All it's saying that the Egyptians were fearful this could happen. That maybe some sort of other nation comes in and they go, hey, wait a second, you're not Egyptians. Why don't you join us with the fight and overtake the Egyptians? And so they're worried that this could be the case. But on the other hand, they want Israel to stay in Egypt. So notice what it says here at the end of verse 10. It says, Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, when there falleth out any war, that they join also unto our enemies and fight against us. And so you'd expect to see, if it stopped there, that what they're implying is that, well, we don't want to be overtaken. But then they get to the other part of the verse here, and it says, and so get them up out of the land. In other words, they decide to leave. In other words, they use the other nation that comes in to fight, and they use that to free the ability for them to leave the land. So what are they saying here? In other words, Israel was viewed to be an important part of society. They needed the Israelites there to help accomplish the work. And so right now, remember, Israel is free. Israel is just dwelling among the land. They're not slaves at this point. So that means that they're a vital part of the economy. And so Israel was part of what was making Egypt strong. Israel was an important part of their economy or their system. And this would be connected to their buying and selling, the jobs that they held, the jobs that they did, the roles that they played in the society. So Egypt wanted them there. They needed them there. And so this was all part, they're stepping back and they're realizing, okay, we have a problem But we also need these people here to help make sure the economy works forward. Think about it today. A lot of immigrants that come in, they come in and work in a lot of different areas in low-wage employment. What if all of a sudden we were to take them out? What would happen to these farms? What would happen to these different companies that utilize this labor? It would not go well because of how they're integrated into the system. Also, even if, for example, you didn't take the immigrant situation. What if you just had, for example, a whole bunch of people groups that just decided to leave our society? What would happen to the companies they work for? What would happen to the communities that they're involved in? All of a sudden, if you just imagine, what if 70% of the population of the United States just left? What would happen to our economy? It would not go well. And so I think this is what the Egyptians are saying here. It's not necessarily just low-wage earners, but it's also just people that were critical to the structure of the Egyptian society. And so they realize there's a problem. They're not integrating into society. They're a distinct people group. And so this is also something that's very important to realize. It's not just that they're there helping and they're part of society. They were different. Because what happens in America generally is people come in the first generation and they're different. They speak a different language, they dress different, they have different customs. But what happens in the second generation, the third generation? They become part of the melting pot. They eventually work their way in, for the most part, but not for Israel. They were different than the Egyptian society, and they kept distinct for that reason. So even though they were starting to move out of Goshen, I believe, and started working in other parts, they were still distinct because they could see they were still distinct. And if they weren't distinct, there'd be no concern for what Pharaoh would say here when, in verse 9, when he says, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." Why would that matter unless Israel was still distinct? You see, they were still separate. They had not integrated in. And so they're worried about what's going to happen. And so they make a plan here. Verse 11. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, we're not told how all this unfolds or what this fully entails here in verse 11. But it's connected with this change in leadership and his new strategy that he puts out. Israel's role in Egyptian society changes. Something changes. And what this seems to be connected with is rights are taken away. It's not any different in our society again, where what happens is the government slowly starts taking away rights of the people, and they start becoming changed in their role in society. And so something's going on here in Egypt where they're taking rights away, and they're starting to put them into a place of where they are in society of being of a lower status or class than the Egyptians. And so they might have been put in different jobs or roles that somehow put them into a servant type of a role. And so maybe they took jobs away from this. Said, no, you can't do that anymore. You can do this stuff over here. And so they said, okay, fine, we'll do this. We like living here. This is our country. This is a place where we live now. And they just start moving into a different type of role. And so we can see here, though, for sure in verse 11, that they're put in place to build cities. And so it's important to realize Israel did not help the Egyptians build the pyramids. The pyramids were already there. What this says is they built cities like Pithom and Ramses. And so two particular cities are listed. Now keep in mind that there are a number of times in the Bible that a name is used for a location. And the name that's used for a location is the future name of that location. So just because we read here in verse 11 that we see Pithom and Ramses, and many people then use this word Ramses to connect this to Pharaoh Ramses. And then say, well, Pharaoh Ramses built the city of Ramses, and therefore it must have been Ramses that came into control and put the children of Israel into bondage and built his city. But that's not the case at all here. Is that what we see that what seems to be the situation is that one of the cities that they built later became known as Ramses. And so because that was a famous city, that ends up being the name that is used when the book of Exodus is written down. And so just realize that this is not, because the word Ramses is used, does not mean that the Pharaoh had to be Ramses. It's more just, I think, a connection of the name to the location of a future name that was famous. And so Ramses is the Pharaoh that comes later in time. And if we adopt Ramses as being the Pharaoh, a whole lot of things become out of whack, and now we need to use secular history to rewrite the Bible and the timeline. And so the right way to do this is let the Bible determine the timeline, and then fill in the gaps and let secular history work its way around the edges here. That's the way we should do this. So what we can see here in verse 11 is that some sort of servitude was applied to the Israelites. It must have been gradual. And so they were not forced, they were forced somehow into the situation, but it wasn't a drastic change. It was more of a strategic change that the Egyptian government implemented over a period of time. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, just talks about almost like a gradual thing, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And so here we see there's been a change in verses 12 through 14. First, it was a light sort of servitude, but now the servitude turns into slavery. We're not told the timing of this, but we get this idea that it happened gradually. And so something here in 12 and through 13 and 14 is changing. So there's a less serious of hard labor, and hard labor is brought on after the Egyptians realized that this wasn't working. They're trying to control the population. They wanted them there, but not let them grow even further. But they don't want them to leave either, but they also want to be in control. So they're trying to balance this scale here. But the Israelites were still growing and becoming stronger. So does this mean that another year passes, or 3 years passes, or 5 years passes? I'm not sure. I want to lean towards the side that it was a smaller number of years versus a larger number of years. The text doesn't say, but I don't think you need to have 50 years go by from verse 11 to verse 12. I think you can have 5 years, even less, or even 3 years, that they realize that, wait a second, they're still multiplying, they're still having babies, they're still having a lot. And some people have even commented to say it's very possible that the Israelites were having twins and triplets and quadruplets and going on, and possibly even having, just a large families at the same time. They're looking around going, wait a second, they just had 4 more over here and 5 more over here and 2 more over here. So do we know this from the text? No, but this is part of God growing his people, and it's not unreasonable to make these connections, especially in relation to the Egyptians. And so what we do see in moving into verse 12 is that things got a whole lot worse. Things were getting harder and harder for the Israelites. And what might have been the case is that had Egypt moved immediately on this, that this may have caused an uprising. So if we had immediately gone to verses 12, 13, and 14 from verse 9 and 10, there may have been an uprising. But what seems to happen is the Egyptians slowly started working this in and increasing the burden and changing, and so the Israelites would not have necessarily seen this coming. And where they were now is because their initial servitude, there was they didn't have the ability to push back. And so I think what happened is they had light servitude, and then by the time it got really bad, they didn't have the ability to unify and push back or do anything about it. And this is how it happens, how enslavement happens in a nation. And you kind of think where we are today in the servitude we have. And when something that happens slowly, and before you know it, all of a sudden we have a bad situation. Some people have compared to this what happened with Germany in World War II, and putting the Jews into servitude, into bondage, into concentration camps. Things happened, and all of a sudden, boom, before you knew it, the Jews were enslaved. And so I'm not saying that the exact same thing happened here, but things can happen over time, and all of a sudden, when society's behind it, things can kind of ratchet down. And even though there's a large number of people, they can be pushed together and into servitude. Now, what I want to do at this point is to help provide some context regarding how long this period of time lasted. Because the majority of Christianity teaches that Israel was enslaved for 400 years. And so they look at verses 12 through 14 and the rigor that they served with and the bondage that they were involved in. And this was a long duration of time. Now, we covered this before, but because it's worth repeating, I want to go over this again. Because this is a big deal in regards to our perspective on what's going on here. Because how long did God have his people in bondage? Was it for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations? And so this puts a different perspective on who God is and what he does to his people. Because after all, was not Israel supposed to be God's chosen people? Was God's whole plan here just to grow a big nation, to put them in bondage for 400 years? And so I believe that there is a much shorter period of time here. And so rather than having to ask ourselves the question, what took God so long to free his people for 400 years, if we have a right understanding of putting the verses together here, we can understand that this was a much shorter period of time. And so why do many people think Israel was in slavery for 400 years? Well, the start of that happens back in Genesis chapter 15. If we turn back to Genesis 15, we look at a place here where God is communicating with Abraham. So Genesis chapter 15, take a look at verse 13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So here we have this reference to 400 years. But also realize we also see the word affliction, so that's the reason why people associate that with bondage. But realize what this is saying is that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. When God gives Abraham this promise, he has not given Abraham the land of Canaan. It's still the land of Canaan. There's still a stranger there. So this does not mean right at the onset that this has to be 400 years in Egypt. Technically, they can still be a stranger, and we're going to see a spot here later on in Hebrews that Abraham was a stranger or a sojourner. He wasn't in a land that was his yet. And so there's also affliction, of course, in Egypt, but there's also affliction in the land of Canaan. And so we see different elements of that. And so we see here this reference to 400 years and a reference to serving or afflicted 400 years. And so this is not, so even though many people connect this with slavery, it doesn't have to mean that. Especially when we turn to Exodus chapter 12. So Exodus chapter 12. So we've gone through this in different formats, and so hopefully this repetition is helpful. But take a look at Exodus chapter 12 and take a look at verse 40. It says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Now on the surface, we can see this as being consistent with Genesis chapter 15. Because we see 430, 400, it seems like Genesis 15 is dealing with a round number of 400, and we have a specific number of 430. Verse 41, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So we find out that they left Egypt after the 430 years. So we see this reference to 430 years. And this time table from one end to the other is 430 years. So we get this for sure from Exodus 12 and these two verses that we just read. But what we find out, though, is the beginning of the 430 years is connected to not them going into Egypt or even their servitude in Egypt. It's connected to something else. So let's go here to Galatians chapter 3. So I said we've gone over these verses before. Here I should put this into a pictorial form to help out. But take a look at Galatians chapter 3. And if we look at verse 14. So it says in Galatians 3:14 that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Brethren, I speak after the manner of men. Though it be but a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. Now, there's a lot of words in this portion of Scripture, and a number of things are said. But the thing that I want us to pull out for the purpose of this is that we have the connection of a promise given to Abraham, and we also have the injection of the law, which Paul says in verse 17, that I say this, that the covenant which was confirmed before God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. So we have the law, which came 430 years after the promise. With a promise of what? The promise given to Abraham. So verse 16, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds, and as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So the promise given to Abraham was 430 years before the giving of the law. Now we also know the law was given only a couple months after they left Egypt. And so we find out here that this cannot be then, the 400 years cannot be connected to the servitude in Egypt. It has to be connected to Abraham. And so we see this connection. And so if we go back to Genesis chapter 12, so go back to Genesis chapter 12. We see the giving of this promise to Abraham. So we read this earlier, but if we just pick it up in verse 3. In Genesis 12:3 it says, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance, and they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So here we see that Abram took all his things and went into the land of Canaan the same time he received the promise, and we see in verse 4 that he was 75 years old. And if you look at verse 7 in the same chapter, it says, the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar and unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So as you can see here, that at the very beginning of this 430 years, that Abraham was 75 years old when the promise was given and when he entered the land. So here we see this connection. Now if we take another reference point and we go to Genesis 21. We go to Genesis 21, we see the reference to the birth of Isaac. And so we find out with Scripture, we can figure out a number of clues and put some years together here. And in Genesis 21, in verse 5, we find out that Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. So we find out that Abraham was 100 years old. So this means that if Abraham was 100, that means 25 years has now passed since he entered the land. So we find out this is 25 years. So Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Now, if we determine when Jacob was born, we go to Genesis 25. Take a look at Genesis 25 in verse 26. It says, and after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when he bare them. So here we find out that Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born. That means another 60 years has passed at this point. And so we just keep working our way across here. And if you turn to Genesis 47, in Genesis 47 and verse 9, we find out here the age of Jacob when Israel arrives in Egypt. In Genesis 47 and verse 9. And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So again, he refers to Isaac, his father, and his grandfather Abraham as being in the days of their pilgrimage. So they didn't own the land, they're just pilgrims. But we find out here that Jacob was 130 years old when he enters into Egypt, or he stands before Pharaoh at this point. And so this is significant because now we've got 25 years with Abraham, and then Isaac born another 60 years later. Jacob born to Isaac 60 years later, so that's 25 and 60, and then 130 years when Jacob was in the land of Egypt. And so as this tells us, is that they were in the land of Canaan for 215 years. So out of the 430 years, there were strangers in the land of Canaan for 215 of those years. So this helps us give us a perspective. And so then as well, then the converse of that means that they were in Egypt for 215 years. So 430 minus 215 is 215. So we see here of that piece of it. Now that the time becomes, well, how long were they slaves when they were in Egypt? We know it was less than 400 years, but do we know anything else about the text? Well, the answer is yes, we do. And if we, excuse me, one more thing. Take a look at Hebrews chapter 11. I'll confirm one point here. We turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We have the testimony of Abraham. Hebrews chapter 11, and take a look at verse 8. Hebrews 11:8 says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in the tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is of God. And so here we find out that he's a sojourner in the land. He's a stranger in the land. This is not his land, it is a promise. He was dwelling in it, but it wasn't his land yet. God promised to give it to his descendants. Now, let's go back to Exodus, but this time take a look at Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7. We find out here a record of Moses. This is how old Moses was when they went unto Pharaoh and the beginning of the plagues. So this basically has as a timestamp of how old Moses was when they left Egypt. Take a look at verse 7. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. So this tells us that Moses was 80 when Israel leaves Egypt. And so this tells us as well that there was 80 years before that when Moses was born. So the question becomes is how long were they in servitude? So here we have an 80-year period at the very end of the period. Let's take a look at another thing here. If we take a look at Genesis chapter 41. And we consider Genesis 41, we see a reference to how old Joseph was. In Genesis 41, take a look at 46. Genesis 41 and verse 46. It says, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So this is right before we had the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. So Joseph was 30 years old. And if we take a look at Genesis 45, another timestamp here, in Genesis 45, we find out in Genesis 45, in verse 6, this is when Israel comes into the land. This is when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. It says, for these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. So this tells us that Joseph was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh. 7 years of plenty had passed, so that means to be 37. And then 2 more years come when his brothers now know that Joseph is Joseph, and they go back and get their father. So that means 37 plus 2 is 39. That means that I just changed that first thing in the break there, Jacob was 130 and Joseph was 30 when Israel enters into Egypt. Now, if we take a look at one more place here, let's take a look at Genesis 50. We just covered this a few weeks back when we ended. Take a look at Genesis chapter 50 and verse 26. It says, "So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." So this means that Joseph died when he was 110. So if he was 39 when Israel entered Egypt, he was 39 at that point, and he was 110 when he died, that means that 71 years passed. And we know they're not enslaved at that point. And so this is a helpful time reference because we now have 71 years at the beginning. And we're trying to figure out when the enslavement happened. It had to happen sometime after the 71 years. And if you were to take 215 minus 71, that's 144. So they're enslaved at most for 144 years. But we have this gap in between here, 64 years. And just because Joseph died, it doesn't mean that immediately they went into bondage. I don't think that was the case at all. Because we know from the text that we read in Exodus chapter 1, there was a period of time when they went into light servitude. And then at a certain point, they went into heavier servitude. But when we take a look at something more, let's take a look at Acts chapter 7. Let's take a look at one more thing. We're almost done here. We're not going to go any farther in the text. Acts chapter 7. We have the testimony or the speech or the preaching of Stephen going on. And if you look at verse 17. So Acts 7:17. So I'm not going to go through entire thing that Stephen says here. But this is one of the things that he says. He says in verse 17, as he recounts Israel's history. He says, "But when the time of the promise drew nigh," the promise of what? The promise that was given to Abraham that God's people would inherit a land. So when the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. So we see here the growing, the multiplication of the Israelites. Verse 18, "Till another king arose which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children to the end they might not live." So we haven't gotten to that part yet in Exodus. That's when they were killing the newborns. So we'll see that at the end of chapter 1, and we see the sparing of Moses by his family in Exodus chapter 2. Verse 20, though, notice it says, "In which time Moses was born and was exceeding fair and nourished up his father's house 3 months." And so what I believe is going on here, as is indicate, is that Moses was born around the same time that they started killing the babies. That I don't think what was happening was they were killing babies for years and years and years and years, but rather they were only killing them for a short period of time. And so we have the record of the midwives that were charged to kill the babies, and Pharaoh observed during a period of time that the babies were not being killed. And then eventually they instructed the people to start killing, taking matters in their own hands and squealing on them, basically. And so that might have only happened for a year or two, maybe 3, maybe 5 at most. And so we have this window of time. The question is, for 64 years, what portion did the enslavement happen? I don't think it was towards the end of that 64 years, not the beginning. But either way, so what we have here is that we have 80 to 144 years of the enslavement period. I want to say that it was somewhere between 80 and 85 years. I can't be dogmatic about that, but when you take a look at Acts chapter 7, And again, you read verse 19, it says, "The same dealt subtly with our kindred in evil, and treated our fathers, so they cast out their young children, to the end they might not live, in which time Moses was born." And so I believe that Moses was born towards the end of the 64 years. Or he was born, at the end of the 64 years, but the enslavement would have happened sometime before then. So that means the enslavement period was sometime of 80 to 144 years. In other words, a generation, or a long generation of individuals. And so I believe that they're enslaved for a single generation of individuals. It's not like generation after generation was born into slavery. At most, I said you've got 144. So at most, you've got 2 generations. But I think it's more likely that God just basically had them enslaved for a single generation. So the same generation that was enslaved was the same generation that was redeemed. I think it's a significant point to make and understand is that God is not a God of enslavement. God is a God of redemption. And that he gave his people the opportunity to see enslavement. And there was a whole generation, yes, but that same generation saw the redemption. And possibly so, it might have even been the same generation as we dealt with at the end of Genesis chapter 50 that sat on Joseph's knees. I think it's very possible. And so you put all these different pieces together, I think it paints a much different picture than the entire enslavement being for 400 years. Now next week we'll finish up chapter 1 and move into chapter 2. And because we see here chapter 1 is setting up the stage for the appearance of Moses who comes in chapter 2. Moses is God's prophet. Moses is the individual that will redeem God's people. He will stand before Moses will stand before Pharaoh and represent God's people to free them. He will be the spokesman to lead the way, to guide his people for freedom, for redemption. So let's go ahead and let's close at this time.